She looked like just another young woman coming home. But the truth was, she commanded an entire FBI tactical unit, a quiet suburban street under the scorching afternoon sun. Neighbors' sprinklers click rhythmically, a couple of kids ride, bikes, their laughter carrying through the air. It's the kind of scene where nothing bad should happen. But on this particular day, in a neighborhood governed by an overzealous homeowners association, everything changed in a matter of seconds. Jada Williams had just returned from a grueling 14-hour day. Her car rolled slowly down the street, familiar houses passing by, some with perfect lawns, others with HOA violation notices taped to their mailboxes. She wasn't just coming home. She was returning to the house she had bought for her retired parents. For Jada, this neighborhood was supposed to be a sanctuary, a reward for years of grueling service and sacrifice. But to one man, she didn't belong. The HOA's self-appointed security officer, Doug Keller, had been patrolling in his dusty golf cart since morning. A former small-town cop who'd been let go under unclear circumstances, Doug treated the neighborhood like his personal jurisdiction. He carried a holstered sidearm, despite the fact that the HOA had no formal security force, and his authority was nothing more than a title he'd given himself. When Jada's black SUV turned into the cul-de-sac, Doug's eyes narrowed. In his mind, she didn't look like someone who lived there. He assumed she was visiting, or worse, trespassing. Unbeknownst to Doug, the woman behind the wheel wasn't just a resident. She was a decorated FBI tactical commander with years of high-stakes hostage rescue operations under her belt. She had been trained to read danger before it unfolded, to stay calm under impossible pressure. And in a few moments, that training would be tested in a way she never expected, in her own neighborhood. As Jada pulled into her driveway, Doug's golf cart screeched to a stop behind her car. The sudden noise made her glance in the rearview mirror. She saw a middle-aged white man wearing aviator sunglasses and a faded security vest, one hand resting dangerously close to his weapon. He didn't start with a greeting. He started with suspicion. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "This is private property," Doug said, his tone sharp. "This is my home," Jada replied evenly, stepping out of her car with her key fob still in hand. Doug's eyes flicked over her natural curls pulled back, her fitted blazer from work, her badge lanyard still hanging around her neck. But he didn't register the federal emblem. All he saw was a black woman standing in his neighborhood. "That's funny," he said, smirking. "I don't remember seeing you around here." "I've lived here for 2 years," Jada said. "My parents are inside. Now, if you'll excuse me—" But Doug stepped forward, his posture aggressive. "Hold on. I need to see some ID, and—" "Keep your hands where I can see them." The demand wasn't just offensive, it was dangerous. And then, in one split-second escalation, Doug unlatched the holster strap on his gun. The movement was subtle, but to Jada's trained eyes, it was a threat as loud as a cocked hammer. Inside the house, Jada's father, Henry Williams, had just settled into his armchair when he heard the voices outside. He rose, his joints stiff, and walked to the window. What he saw made his heart sink, his daughter being cornered on their own driveway by a man with his hand on a gun. Henry flung the door open. "Is there a problem here?" Doug didn't take his eyes off Jada. "Sir, I'm handling a possible trespasser." Henry's voice shook with disbelief. "Trespasser? That's my daughter." But Doug was past listening. The smell of control, of power, was too intoxicating. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the vehicle and keep your hands visible." Jada exhaled slowly. Her mind wasn't panicking. She was assessing. Distance to target. 12 feet. His stance. Right foot slightly back. Dominant hand on grip. Her odds of disarming him before a shot. High, but unnecessary, unless he drew. Her training screamed for restraint. This wasn't a mission in hostile territory. This was her driveway. She reached into her blazer and pulled out her credentials. Not slowly, but with deliberate, fluid precision. The gold badge glinted in the sunlight. FBI, she said, her voice cold and steady. Tactical operations. Commander, remove your hand from that weapon now. For the first time, Doug hesitated, his face twisted from arrogance to disbelief. But instead of apologizing, he scoffed. Anyone can flash a fake badge. It was at that moment that Jada knew this wasn't about protocol. It was about prejudice. And prejudice, when armed, was a ticking time bomb. Her father stepped down the porch, his voice trembling with controlled fury. You've been harassing black residents here for months. Now you're pointing a gun at my daughter? You picked the wrong one today. Doug's radio crackled faintly, but he didn't answer. The air was heavy, tense. Each second stretched to the breaking point. Jada didn't flinch. I suggest you call your supervisor, because in about 5 minutes, this driveway is going to be filled with federal agents, and your HOA is going to have a problem they can't sweep under the rug. Doug blinked, as if realizing for the first time that the power dynamic had shifted entirely. The woman he thought he could intimidate was, in reality, a woman who could dismantle his life with a single report. But the confrontation wasn't over. Not by a long shot. For a long, brittle moment, the only sounds were the faint ticking of Jada's still-warm engine and the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the street. Doug's fingers hovered over the grip of his pistol like a man, deciding whether to double down or back away. He didn't know it yet, but every second he delayed was digging the hole deeper. Jada's calm was the kind that unsettled dangerous men, measured, unshaken, surgically precise. She had stared down armed hostage-takers, negotiated under sniper, scopes, and walked through doors that could have been wired with explosives. But here, in the neighborhood her hard work had paid for, she faced a man whose authority was nothing more than a fantasy, and whose prejudice made him dangerous. Henry stepped closer, his fists clenched. You need to step away from my daughter. Right now, he warned, his voice low but edged with steel. Doug smirked, as if refusing to be ordered by a black man was part of his code. Sir, this is HOA business. We've had reports of... Reports of what? Henry snapped. Of a black woman driving a nice car? Of a homeowner using her driveway? Doug's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked like a man who had just realized the script in his head wasn't going the way he rehearsed it. Jada, still holding her badge where the sun caught the gold, spoke into the small mic clipped inside her blazer. Unit 6-4, this is Commander Williams. Code 7 at my location. I need 2 units for officer safety verification. Her voice was smooth, almost casual, but the coded language wasn't for Doug. It was for the 2 FBI tactical operators who, at that very moment, were nearby running a low-profile surveillance op in the next town. Doug's brow furrowed. Who are you talking to? You'll find out in about 90 seconds, Jada replied without looking at him. Inside the house, Jada's mother, Lillian, had joined Henry at the porch steps. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the searing insult of seeing her daughter, treated like a suspect in her yard. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade. You point that gun at my child one more time, and you'll see what happens when you mess with the wrong family. Down the street, a neighbor peeked through their blinds. Another stood on their lawn, phone in hand, pretending to scroll while recording everything. In neighborhoods like this, gossip spreads faster than the HOA newsletter. But this time, the "oh" whispers wouldn't fade. The sound came first, a low rumble, then the staccato growl of 2 black unmarked SUVs accelerating up the street. Doug turned instinctively toward the noise, his posture stiffening as the vehicles came into view. The SUVs stopped so abruptly that the scent of hot brakes drifted into the air. Out stepped 4 figures in plain clothes. But the cut of their jackets, the squared stances, and the earpieces spoke louder than any uniform. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with close-cropped hair, scanned the scene and locked eyes with Jada. Commander, you good? Doug's jaw dropped. "Commander!" "Yeah," Jada said, never taking her eyes off him. "We've got an unauthorized armed civilian detaining a homeowner without cause. Document everything." Two agents immediately began recording the interaction, from multiple angles. Another positioned himself between Jada and Doug, not aggressively, but with the quiet authority of someone who could end the encounter in half a second if needed. Doug's hands twitched at his sides. "I'm just doing my job," he stammered. "Your job," Jada repeated, stepping forward until there were only a few feet between them. "Your job is to follow the law, not to make it up based on who you think belongs here." The taller agent, a former Marine named Ortiz, took a measured step toward Doug. "Sir, do you have any formal law enforcement authority?" Doug hesitated. "I'm HOA security." "Translation," Ortiz said evenly. "You're a civilian with a gun and no badge. That means right now you're walking a skinny line between harassment and a felony." Doug glanced around, realizing the street was no longer his domain, but a stage where every neighbor was a witness. His bluster faltered. "Look, I thought that's the problem," Jada cut in sharply. "You thought you knew who I was. You thought you knew my place. And you were dead wrong." Henry's voice, calm but loaded with years of restrained anger, followed. "We've dealt with your kind in this neighborhood before. But now you messed with someone who can make sure you never do this again." Doug's eyes darted between the agents and the gathering neighbors. The weight of the moment settled on him. The realization that the script had flipped completely, and the woman he'd tried to intimidate now held all the power. But Jada wasn't done. She turned to Ortiz. "Document his weapon, serial number, and holster condition. I want a full report to the U.S. Attorney's Office by tomorrow morning." "Yes, ma'am." Doug's face flushed. "That's not necessary. It's already happening," Jada said. "And if you think this ends with a warning, you have no idea who you just pulled a gun on." The street was silent except for the rustle of leaves and the faint hiss of sprinklers. It was the kind of silence that comes when a community witnesses a line being drawn in the sand, one that wouldn't be erased by the HOA's next meeting. And as Doug stood there, stripped of the false authority he had worn like armor, Jada knew the fight wasn't just about her. It was about every black homeowner who'd been questioned in their neighborhood, every parent who'd warned their kids to stay calm if confronted, every life that could have ended differently if fear had been allowed to pull the trigger. But this wasn't over, not until the consequences came crashing down. Doug Keller didn't sleep that night. Word of the confrontation had spread like wildfire. Neighbors' videos were already circulating in group chats, and one clip had even made it to a local news producer. The footage was damning. A white HOA security guard unholstering his weapon on a black homeowner's daughter, only to be surrounded by federal agents minutes later. By morning, the HOA board was in crisis mode. They called an emergency meeting, not to apologize, but to contain the scandal. But there was no containing what was coming. Jada had already filed a formal report with the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, ensuring there was a paper trail that couldn't be buried. She also contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office, requesting an investigation into possible civil rights violations and unlawful use of a firearm by an unlicensed security officer. The HOA president, a silver-haired man named Carl Peterson, called Henry early that day, his voice full of artificial concern. "Henry, I just wanted to say this is all a misunderstanding. Doug's heart was in the right place." Henry cut him off cold. "Pointing a gun at my daughter isn't a misunderstanding, Carl. It's a crime. And you're going to see what happens when you cover for men like him." Meanwhile, the FBI's internal channels buzzed. Jada's fellow commanders, agents, and even the director's office heard the story. There was outrage, but also an unspoken recognition. Jada had handled the situation with the kind of restraint that saved lives. That afternoon, Ortiz returned to the neighborhood. Not in an unmarked SUV this time, but in his car, wearing jeans and a polo. He walked up Jada's driveway holding a manila folder. "It's moving fast," he said, handing it over. Inside were copies of Doug's firearm records, HOA bylaws showing there was no authorized armed security program, and statements from multiple neighbors, some white, some black, confirming that Doug had a history of targeting certain residents. One statement stood out. It came from a white retired teacher named Mrs. Holloway, who had lived in the neighborhood for 30 years. In shaky handwriting, she wrote, "I've seen Mr. Keller stop young black men and women more times than I can count. I regret never speaking up before. What he did to Commander Williams was beyond wrong." That statement would become a key part of the case. 2 days later, the local police, pressured by the U.S. Attorney's Office, arrived at Doug's modest home with a warrant. He was arrested for unlawful detention, brandishing a weapon, and menacing. The charges weren't minor. They carried real prison time. When the news broke, the HOA board scrambled to distance itself from him. Carl Peterson released a carefully worded statement about deep regret and commitment to community safety, but it rang hollow. Too many residents knew the truth. They had let Doug act like a sheriff for years, and now they were paying the price. The media coverage shifted quickly from local incident to a broader conversation about racial profiling in suburban neighborhoods. Jada, reluctant at first, agreed to one televised interview, not to talk about her career but to make a point that went beyond her. Sitting under studio lights, she looked straight into the camera. "I want to be clear. This isn't just about me. I'm alive today because I have the training to de-escalate an armed confrontation. But too many people didn't walk away from situations like this. And we have to stop pretending these are isolated incidents. They're not." Her words hit like a hammer. Across the country, people shared the clip, using hashtags that connected her story to countless others. In the weeks that followed, the HOA voted, under immense pressure, to implement sweeping changes. There would be no armed patrols without state-certified law enforcement officers. All security positions would require formal training and background checks. More importantly, a diversity and anti-bias policy was put into place, though Jada knew policies alone weren't enough. Doug took a plea deal, avoiding a long trial but accepting a permanent ban on carrying a firearm, probation, and mandatory bias counseling. For a man who had built his identity around authority, it was a crushing fall. One quiet evening, about a month after it happened, Jada sat on her parents' porch with her father. The cicadas hummed in the distance. Henry sipped his tea and glanced at his daughter. "You know," he said, "when I saw that man with his hand on his gun, all I could think about was losing you. But you didn't just walk away. You stood up, not just for you, but for all of us." Jada smiled faintly, her eyes scanning the street where kids played and neighbors waved as they passed. "I stood up because I could, Dad. But we've got to keep standing until everyone's safe in their own home. That's the real win." It wasn't the kind of victory with cheers and parades. It was quieter, deeper, the kind of victory that comes from knowing a dangerous line had been crossed and pulled back, the kind where dignity was defended, not with rage, but with unshakable resolve. And in that neighborhood, under the watchful glow of porch lights, one thing was certain. No one would ever again mistake Jada Williams for someone who didn't belong.